Hey everyone, thank you all so much for tuning in. Today I wanted to discuss a canceled project that was actually in the works at Monolith, the studio that is bringing us Wonder Woman. They brought us the Middle-earth games, and this isn't a project that we just barely found out about it. We've actually known about it for years, but some new footage has leaked, some photos have leaked, and some that we already had seen in the past have resurfaced, bringing this discussion back into the limelight. The Twitter thread that brought this back up has more details than I will probably give in this video, so I'll link that in the description below. But long story short, before Shadow of Mordor, Monolith was working on an Arkham-style game that would have been set in Christopher Nolan's universe. We don't know, as far as I'm aware, exactly how this would have fit in that universe. My assumption is that it would have been a game set between the events of Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, although I suppose it could have been a sequel to The Dark Knight Rises, or perhaps it would have been a tie-in in aesthetic only. In other words, you would have been playing as the Nolanverse Batman, but in a more original, soft rebooted story, where the events of the films aren't necessarily canon, though they are very influential. I don't know what approach this game was going to take. We do know it was going to feature the Nemesis system that made its way into Shadow of Mordor, and that makes a lot of sense. The Nemesis system feels like it was built for a Batman game, and it's honestly a shame that it hasn't been used in a Batman game yet. It would have been really fun to see in Arkham Knight, and I think it actually would have been a huge selling point if it had been featured in Gotham Knights. In case you haven't played the Middle-earth games, the Nemesis system is a system that basically allows enemies to remember their encounters with you. So for example, if you're getting overwhelmed by an enemy and you run away, that enemy will get promoted, and then the next time they see you, they will recall when, where, and what transpired the last time they saw you. They'll say, hey, remember back on the hill when you fled like a coward? And it just adds a lot of narrative into the moment-to-moment gameplay. Sometimes you would get ambushed by other enemies, sometimes they would get promoted, and so the power dynamic was always shifting, and it made the world feel more alive. It was a really incredible system that honestly was more fun to play than the main story. So the idea of a Batman game where you could just randomly get ambushed by Deadshot, and if you have to run away because he's more powerful than you, he gets more buffs, and you have to really plan and strategize for your next encounter with him, would be really cool. Or you have to interrogate enough enemies to learn the strengths and weaknesses of Black Mask so you can effectively take him down, and then Penguin gets promoted to take his place. It would feel like a living, thriving Gotham City underworld that you're constantly having to adjust your approach to. Now, as far as the actual gameplay looks in this game that we can see from the footage, a lot of people have noted the similarities to Arkham, but I would also say that there's a surprising amount of similarities to Batman Begins, the movie tie-in game from 2005. It looks a lot like a more grounded take on what Rocksteady did, which is very fitting for a Nolanverse tie-in. I also think that the aesthetics look great. It has that yellowish hue around the city that really feels reminiscent of Batman Begins. There are a few more details that I do hope get out there somehow, because I would like to know what the plot of this game was going to be. Like I mentioned earlier, would be interested to know where in the Nolanverse timeline it was going to be set, what villains they were planning on using, and how true they were going to stay to the Nolanverse approach. Was this going to be a game that really shook the norms of this franchise and introduced characters like Killer Croc and Mr. Freeze? Or would it have stuck more to what you would expect from a Nolan Batman story and featured characters like Penguin and Hush and Black Mask? With the main difference between this game and the Arkhamverse games being the fact that it has the Nemesis system, I do think the villains really would have mattered here. The system still would have been cool if it was just procedurally generated thugs, but to me the whole novelty of having a Nemesis system in a Batman game is so that you can go up against those characters like Deadshot and Deathstroke and Mr. Freeze and some of those more known Batman rogues. I feel like just by putting it in the Nolanverse, you are kind of limiting what you can do, because you either have to use just inherently realistic characters, or you have to try to reimagine them in a more realistic way in order to make them feel like they're in line with what Nolan wanted this universe to be. There are still plenty of villains that they could have picked from. Riddler, Harley Quinn, they could have brought Scarecrow back, they could have all been involved in the Nemesis system, and it really could have been an interesting spin on the lore and a more grounded approach than what Rocksteady did. I do think that's a really compelling idea. It also feels similar to what they did with the Sam Raimi movie tie-in games for Spider-Man, where they had villains like Shocker and Black Cat and Mysterio who didn't appear in the films, but showed up and kind of made the lore of that universe feel bigger I feel like that was one of the best uses of fan service in mainstream media ever. To say, yeah, we know that we haven't included some of these fan favorite characters in the films, so we're going to go ahead and put them in the games with the same aesthetic as the films so that you can see what could have been potentially. Again, the Nolanverse does feel kind of like an odd choice to do this in, though, because there isn't tons that you could do outside of the films, because the films pretty much cover Batman's whole career. I feel like if you were making a Keaton Batman game set after the events of Batman Returns, that would almost feel like you'd have a little bit more leeway to do something there. Overall, this is a project that I would have been interested in playing. I do think that there's some pros and cons to the concept, but overall, I do think it's a really interesting idea. However, I wouldn't have wanted to play it at the expense of the Arkham games. This is ultimately the reason that Warner Brothers decided to not move forward with this project and transformed it into the Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor game instead, was that they didn't want two competing Batman game franchises on the market at the same time, which makes total sense. If you're trying to advertise Batman Arkham Knight, do you really want the mainstream audience like, wait, is this canon to the Nolanverse now? I know some people say, no, people would have been able to understand that they were distinct universes, but to this day, people think Gotham Knights is still an Arkham game. So it's really not that easy to differentiate. And then you have the fan base split. Instead of just having one definitive Batman gaming franchise, you'd have that and a Nolanverse one. And having both could have hurt each one individually in terms of sales and reception. People could have started pitting the two against each other. I can understand why this isn't something that Warner Brothers wanted to move forward with at the time. With that being said, I do think it would have been really interesting to get this game after the Arkham series when there was that huge drought of Batman games. I wonder what the reception would have been if 2 years after Arkham Knight in like 2017 or maybe 2018, Warner Brothers had said, hey, we're releasing a new Arkham-style game. It's set in the Nolanverse and features the Nemesis system. At this point, I think it's pretty clear that there's no hope for this game to get reworked or re-released or anything. Monolith is currently working on a Wonder Woman game, which I'm very excited for, and I do think there is a distinct possibility that if Wonder Woman does well, perhaps Monolith will get their chance to create a Batman game, but I think it would be set in an original universe. I don't think it would be set in the Nolanverse at this point. However, I do think there is one more chance for the Nolanverse to get a video game adaptation, and that would be in the form of a Lego Batman game that was stylized in the way that the Skywalker saga was stylized. A Batman game that features the events of all of the films from the 60s to the Burtonverse, to the Schumacherverse, to the Nolanverse, to the Reevesverse. That would make more sense because then you're advertising basically every Batman movie and you're getting a new generation interested in the legacy of this character and the films that have come before, rather than trying to breathe new life into a franchise that ended in 2012. Seeing this trilogy adapted into Lego for a video game would be really interesting, and I would very much be on board, but outside of that, I just don't see a lot of hope for another Nolanverse project. Really ever. It feels like Nolan said what he wanted to say with it, and we're to a point where I don't know that the producers at Warner Brothers are interested in bringing that universe back. This was a project that I can see why it made sense at the time. I can see why they didn't move forward with it. I would have liked to have played it, but again, I'm so happy with what we got when it comes to the Arkham games that I'm glad that this didn't come out and potentially screw up the plans of moving forward with Arkham Origins and Arkham Knight. But now it's your turn. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this project. How does it look to you? Would you have been interested in playing it? Let me know, and please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys in the next one.